Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back, to an age where the clinking of tankards wasn't just a sign of revelry, but a fundamental part of daily survival. Imagine, if you will, the faint light of dawn barely piercing the thick, damp air of a medieval monastery. You're rousing from a hard, straw-filled cot, the chill seeping into your bones despite the rough wool habit you sleep in. The first sound you register, beyond the distant bleating of sheep and the rustle of the wind through ancient trees, is a low murmur from the refectory. It's not just the pre-dawn prayers being chanted, it's the quiet movement of brothers, already preparing for the day. And what, you might wonder, is the very first thing on the menu for these pious souls, even before the sun properly crests the horizon? Why, a generous draught of ale. Of course, not a small, polite serving, mind you, but a significant, thirst-quenching, calorie-rich portion. You stretch, feeling the stiffness in your joints from hours of kneeling and manual labor. And the thought of that first sip of cool, dark liquid is surprisingly comforting, almost a balm. This isn't some fanciful tale spun for entertainment, but a glimpse into the very real, very practical existence of medieval monks. Their lives, though seemingly austere, were deeply intertwined with the production and consumption of beer. Forget your delicate lattes and sparkling waters. For these men, beer was lifeblood, sustenance, and medicine all rolled into one. And you're about to spend the next several hours immersed in their world, understanding why a daily intake that would put most modern-day frat parties to shame was not only common, but absolutely essential for their survival. You probably won't survive this. Their dedication, their discipline, their sheer capacity for physical endurance, all fueled by what we would now consider an astronomical amount of fermented grain, is truly mind-boggling. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where are you tuning in from? What time is it for you right now? Drop a comment below, and feel free to like and follow the channel if you're keen to continue this journey with me through the long, dark medieval night. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The scent of damp earth and old parchment hangs heavy in the air, mingling subtly with the yeasty aroma of the monastic brewhouse. You rise, pulling on your cowl, the rough fabric of familiar embrace, as you shuffle toward the refectory, your bare feet on the cold stone floor. You can already hear the low hum of voices and the occasional clink of a pottery mug, the promise of that first, hearty gulp of ale, waiting patiently on the long wooden tables, is a small, quiet comfort in the demanding life of a monk. You settle onto a bench, the communal silence only broken by the sound of pouring liquid. It's thick, perhaps a little cloudy, but undeniably nourishing. Historians still argue whether the earliest monastic beers were intentionally low in alcohol, or if the brewing methods simply resulted in weaker brews. Regardless, it was a fundamental part of the monastic diet, a cornerstone of their existence. This wasn't a choice for pleasure. It was a necessity born of the harsh realities of their time. The sheer volume might shock you, but by the time we finish this journey, it will make perfect, practical sense. You lift the mug, the earthenware cool against your lips, and take that first, deep swallow. The day has begun. As the first rays of morning finally banish the last vestiges of night from the monastic compound, you find yourself heading, not for more sleep, but for the chapter house. This is where the Benedictine rule truly comes to life, the bedrock of nearly every aspect of your existence, written by Saint Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century. This rulebook, if you will, laid out a remarkably comprehensive and enduring blueprint for communal monastic life. It wasn't just about prayer and contemplation. It was a practical guide for running a self-sufficient community, from the allocation of duties to the proper amount of sleep, and yes, even to the precise measurements of daily sustenance. You sit on a simple wooden bench, the air still cool, listening intently as the abbot reads from the ancient text, his voice a steady drone that nonetheless carries immense authority. The rule you learn is surprisingly pragmatic, acknowledging human frailty while striving for spiritual perfection. It prescribes a life of moderation. But moderation in the medieval context often looks quite different from our modern understanding. For instance, while it mandates fasting during Lent and on certain holy days, it also makes allowances for the infirm and for those engaged in strenuous labor. This practical approach extended directly to diet, unlike the more austere ascetic practices of some hermits. Benedict understood that a community of men engaged in demanding physical work, farming, building, copying manuscripts, and yes, brewing, needed proper nourishment. One mainstream historical fact about the Benedictine rule is its emphasis on stability, meaning monks were expected to remain in the same monastery for life, fostering a deep sense of community and shared purpose. This stability also ensured that skills, like brewing, were passed down through generations within the monastic walls. You recall a passage from the rule about the importance of labor. Idleness is the enemy of the soul. This isn't just a quaint saying. It's a core principle that keeps you and your brothers busy from dawn till dusk. And all that labor, whether tending the fields, grinding grain, or splitting wood, burns a considerable amount of calories. So, when the rule discusses drink, it's not viewed as an indulgence, but as a necessary part of maintaining health and strength. The daily allowance of wine, for example, was set at a hemina, roughly half a liter. However, and here's a crucial point, the rule often stated that if wine was not available, or if local custom dictated, then something else could be substituted. This something else was almost invariably beer. A quirky tidbit is that the rule even included specific instructions for how the abbot should welcome guests, often involving offering them drink and food, demonstrating the centrality of hospitality and provision within the monastic framework. You can imagine the abbot, having listened to a brother complain about indigestion, offering not a medicinal tea, but a stronger, more fortifying ale, believing its restorative properties. This emphasis on sustenance, particularly liquid sustenance, leads to a fascinating scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the Benedictine rule's dietary provisions were primarily spiritual guidelines or pragmatic health advice for the harsh realities of medieval life. Was the permission to drink beer a concession to comfort or a recognition of its vital role in hydration and nutrition when water was so often unsafe? As you listen to the abbot, you ponder this. The simple fact is that beer provided calories, crucial vitamins, and, perhaps most importantly, a relatively safe source of hydration in a world where clean drinking water was a luxury, not a given. The rule, in its wisdom, didn't forbid alcohol outright, recognizing its place in the medieval diet. It simply cautioned against gluttony and excess, a warning that, given the volume of liquid you'll be consuming, seems quite reasonable. The rhythmic chanting of prayers begins, and you join in, your voice blending with the others, knowing that the physical demands of your life are as much a part of your spiritual journey as the prayers themselves, and that your daily pint, or three, is an integral part of that demanding journey. You're settling into the rhythm of monastic life, the strictures of the Benedictine rule now feeling less like an imposition and more like the very fabric of existence. But let's pause for a moment and consider a fundamental truth of the medieval world, one that often escapes us in our modern era of readily available, crystal clear tap water. Water was dangerous. Congeacum. Seriously dangerous. You might picture picturesque streams bubbling through verdant meadows, but the reality was far grimmer. Urban centers, such as they were, had rudimentary or non-existent sewage systems, meaning human and animal waste often flowed directly into rivers and wells. Farming practices, including the use of animal manure, further contaminated water sources. Even seemingly pristine rural springs could be tainted by unseen bacteria or dissolved minerals that would wreak havoc on your digestive system. Imagine the constant low thrum of anxiety that must have accompanied every sip of plain water. A drink of clear water could easily lead to dysentery, cholera, or a host of other debilitating illnesses that, in an age without antibiotics, were often a death sentence. There was no scientific understanding of germs, no concept of boiling water for purification, beyond perhaps noticing that hot liquids seemed safer. So, while a monk's life was dedicated to spiritual pursuits, it was also a daily gamble with basic hydration. This widespread danger, this ever-present threat of a truly nasty stomach bug, made the consumption of alternative beverages not just a preference, but a matter of sheer survival. It's a mainstream historical fact that contaminated water was a primary cause of disease and death throughout the medieval period, affecting everyone from the lowliest peasant to the highest noble. Though monasteries, with their often isolated locations and communal living, faced particular challenges in ensuring safe hydration for their large populations. This is where beer, and to a lesser extent wine, stepped in as the unsung hero of medieval public health. The brewing process itself, involving boiling the water during mashing and fermentation, served as an unintentional but highly effective purification method. The heat killed off most harmful pathogens, and the alcohol, even in low concentrations, acted as a further deterrent to bacterial growth. So, that mug of ale you're holding isn't just a drink, it's a meticulously, albeit accidentally, sanitized source of liquid. A quirky tidbit related to water purity is that some monasteries were specifically founded near natural springs known for their clean water. But even then, the scale of monastic communities meant that supplementary sources, likely less pure, were often needed. You can almost hear a seasoned monk, a mischievous glint in his eye, recounting tales of a hapless novitiate who dared to drink directly from the village well, only to spend the next week in miserable isolation, cleansing his humors. Historians still argue whether the widespread consumption of alcoholic beverages was a conscious public health strategy or simply a practical adaptation to environmental realities. Was it that they knew boiling water was good, or did they just observe that those who drank beer tended to fare better? It's likely a bit of both. The practical results were clear: those who drank beer were less likely to succumb to the ravages of waterborne diseases. This fundamental problem of unsafe water underscores why the monastic brewhouse wasn't just a luxury or a source of income, but an essential part of the monastic infrastructure. As vital as the infirmary or the scriptorium, you feel the cool liquid slide down your throat, not just refreshing, but reassuring. Each gulp is a small act of defiance against the invisible threats lurking in the medieval world, a silent testament to the ingenuity born of necessity. And as you finish your morning draft, you prepare for the day's labor, knowing that your next hydration break will, thankfully, not be a risky one. With the omnipresent danger of contaminated water firmly established, you now begin to grasp the sheer practicality of the monastic beer consumption. This wasn't just about avoiding illness, it was about survival through sustenance. For medieval monks, beer as nutrition was a foundational concept, not merely a pleasant accompaniment to a meal. Think of it less as a recreational drink and more as a liquid bread, packed with essential calories and nutrients that were often scarce in their simple diets. Your breakfast, for instance, might consist of a chunk of stale bread, perhaps some cheese if you were lucky, and a substantial tankard of ale. That ale wasn't just washing down the bread, it was part of the bread. The brewing process, especially in monasteries, was designed to maximize nutritional content. Unlike modern filtered beers, medieval monastic ales were often thick, cloudy, and unfiltered. This meant they retained a significant amount of the yeast and other solid matter from the grains, which are excellent sources of vitamins, proteins, and various minerals. In an age where diets could be monotonous and lacking in variety, particularly during long fasts or lean seasons, beer provided a vital supplement. It was a caloric powerhouse, a quick and easily digestible source of energy for men engaged in demanding physical labor. From tilling fields to constructing buildings or spending hours meticulously copying manuscripts in dim light. This is a mainstream historical fact. Beer, particularly small beer, was considered a staple foodstuff for all ages and classes in medieval Europe. Not just monks. You might even notice that the beer you drink isn't particularly strong in alcohol content, especially the small beer brewed for daily consumption. This low alcohol percentage meant you could consume large quantities without becoming incapacitated, allowing it to fulfill its role as a primary source of hydration and nutrition throughout the day. A quirky tidbit is that some monastic breweries even experimented with adding other ingredients like oats or honey to their brews, not just for flavor, but to boost the nutritional profile, creating a kind of medieval superfood drink. You can imagine a particularly robust monk, after a long morning of chopping wood, feeling his energy flagging, reaching for another tankard not for enjoyment, but for the immediate boost it provides, almost like a medieval energy drink. Honey, historians still argue whether the high caloric intake from beer contributed to better health outcomes for monks compared to the general population, or if their more disciplined lifestyle was the primary factor. It's a chicken or egg scenario. Did the beer make them healthier, or did their overall monastic routine, including regular meals and less exposure to the chaos of urban life, contribute more significantly? What is clear, however, is that monastic communities were often more resilient to outbreaks of disease than the surrounding populace, and their consistent access to relatively safe and nutritious liquid sustenance undoubtedly played a part. As you finish your morning draft, you feel a subtle warmth spread through your stomach, a feeling of mild satiety. It's not a full meal, but it's enough to fuel the next few hours of prayer and labor. This liquid nutrition, brewed with care and consumed with purpose, truly was the hidden engine of medieval monastic life, allowing these dedicated men to pursue their spiritual and intellectual endeavors with strength and vigor. You know that without it, your daily tasks would be far more arduous, if not impossible. Having understood the vital nutritional role of beer, you now step into the heart of its creation, the monastic brewhouse operations. This isn't some quiet, contemplative corner of the monastery. It's a bustling, hot, and often steamy hub of activity, a place of hard physical labor and precise, if unscientific, chemistry. The air is thick with the sweet, malty aroma of brewing grains, mingling with the earthy scent of wood smoke from the fires beneath the massive copper kettles. You can hear the rhythmic splash of water, the clatter of wooden paddles, and the low murmur of monks coordinating their efforts. This is where the magic happens, transforming simple grain and water into the lifeblood of the community. You observe the process unfold. First, where there's the Irish mashing, curming, where crushed malted barley, sometimes mixed with other grains like oats or wheat, is steeped in hot water. Picture enormous wooden vats, some easily large enough to bathe a small horse, filled with this grainy porridge. Monks, with sleeves rolled up, use long, heavy wooden paddles to stir the mixture constantly, ensuring even temperature distribution and maximizing the extraction of sugars from the malt. It's back-breaking work, the steam rising in billows, making the air humid and warm. This precise temperature control, though managed by feel and experience rather than thermometers, is crucial for activating the enzymes that convert starches into fermentable sugars. This part of the process is a mainstream historical fact mashing, has been the foundational step in brewing for millennia. Next comes the lautering, where the sugary liquid, now called wort, is separated from the spent grain. This is often done by draining the wort through a false bottom in the mash tun, or by transferring the entire mash to a separate vessel with a permeable base, allowing the liquid to filter through. The spent grains, surprisingly, aren't wasted. They often become feed for the monastery's livestock or are even mixed into bread for a fiber boost. You see a monk carefully hosing down the grains, extracting every last bit of sugary goodness. After the wort is collected, it's transferred to a large copper kettle for the while boiling ahium phase. This is where the magic of preservation truly kicks in. The wort is brought to a vigorous boil, a process that both sterilizes the liquid, killing off any lingering bacteria from the water or grains, and allows for the addition of hops, which contribute bitterness, aroma, and crucial preservative qualities. A quirky tidbit is that the monastic brewhouse was often located near a natural spring or well, and sometimes even incorporated sophisticated systems of aqueducts and pipes to bring large volumes of water directly to the brewing vats, a testament to the engineering prowess of some medieval monasteries. Once the boiling is complete, the wort is cooled, often slowly, by simply letting it sit in cooler rooms or transferring it to shallower vessels, and then transferred to fermentation vats. This is where yeast, either wild yeast from the air or yeast collected from previous brews, is introduced, initiating the magical conversion of sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. The air in this part of the house has a distinctly yeasty, slightly pungent smell. Historians still argue whether medieval brewers intentionally pitched yeast from previous batches or simply relied on ambient wild yeast for fermentation. While modern brewing relies on specific yeast strains, medieval monks likely practiced a form of repitching by simply collecting the yeast scum from the top of fermented batches. You watch a monk, his brow furrowed in concentration, checking the bubbling surface of a fermentation vat. The entire operation is a testament to the monk's dedication and practical knowledge, passed down through generations. It's a place of industry, a vital organ of the monastic body, ceaselessly producing the nourishing, safe, and ever-present beverage that fuels their lives. The rhythmic clatter and hiss are a comforting symphony, the heartbeat of the monastery itself, with the brew house operating like a well-oiled machine, churning out batch after batch. It's time to truly grasp the sheer volume of liquid sustenance consumed by a medieval monk. We're talking about one of the daily rations. And prepare yourself, because the numbers are astonishing. While specific amounts varied between monasteries, regions, and even seasons, historical records and archaeological findings consistently point to an incredibly high daily intake of liquid, primarily beer. You might be envisioning a polite half pint with your dinner, but for a medieval monk, that would barely qualify as a mouthwash. Consider the need's intense physical labor, often in varied weather conditions, coupled with a diet that, while adequate, sometimes lack the pure water content we take for granted. A mainstream historical fact is that it was not uncommon for a medieval person, monk or layperson, to consume anywhere from 1 to 3 liters of beer per day. For monks dedicated to a life of rigorous work and often abstaining from meat for significant periods, this consumption often skewed towards the higher end of that spectrum. Imagine yourself, after hours spent tilling fields, or hauling stone for a new cloister, or painstakingly copying texts by the flickering light of a candle, reaching for a cool, refreshing tankard, and then another, and another. That's not just hydration, it's a constant infusion of calories and energy. You probably won't survive this. Think about your own daily water intake. Now, replace most of that with a liquid that, even at its weakest, contains some alcohol and significant nutritional density. It's a remarkable feat of metabolism, perhaps aided by the fact that medieval beer was generally much weaker than modern lagers or ales, often having an alcohol by volume ABV of 1 to 3%. Similar to modern non-alcoholic or small beers. This low ABV was crucial, allowing for high consumption without constant inebriation. A quirky tidbit is that children in medieval times also drank small beer, often from a very young age, as it was considered a safer and more nutritious alternative to contaminated water. So, it wasn't just the monks. An entire society relied on this liquid staple. You might even see a particularly earnest novitiate, barely a teenager, downing his daily allocation with the same stoic determination as the elder brothers, understanding implicitly that it was fueling his growth and strength. Historians still argue whether the daily consumption figures represent actual individual intake or if they are theoretical maximums for the monastery as a whole, including servants and guests. However, the prevailing evidence, including monastic account books detailing vast quantities of grain purchased for brewing, strongly suggests that individual consumption was indeed very high. The fact remains that the monastic brewhouse was working tirelessly to meet a consistently high demand. You feel the constant presence of the ale in your diet. It's there at breakfast, accompanying your meager midday meal, and again in the evening. It provides a steady, if low-level, buzz that takes the edge off the relentless physical demands and the occasional chill of the unheated scriptorium. It's not about getting drunk. It's about staying alive, staying healthy, and staying productive within the confines of a challenging life. Each sip reinforces the reality that beer wasn't a luxury. It was a fundamental component of the medieval food pyramid, a liquid foundation for a world without safe water. Now that you've wrestled with the sheer volume of beer consumed, let's uncork the intricacies of different beer strengths that flowed through monastic life. It wasn't a one-size-fits-all scenario. The monastic brewery, like any good modern craft brewery, produced a range of brews tailored for specific purposes and consumers. This differentiation was crucial for managing resources, ensuring proper nutrition, and maintaining discipline within the community. You might imagine a medieval monk perpetually tipsy, but the reality was far more nuanced and practical. At the very top of the hierarchy, and often reserved for special occasions, guests, or perhaps the abbot himself, was the mug-strong ale nano or ale of grace. This was the potent stuff, brewed with a higher concentration of malt, resulting in a richer flavor and, crucially, a higher alcohol content. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a modern double bock or strong porter. It was a treat, a reward, or a symbol of hospitality, not a daily staple. You might see it served during significant feast days, when the monastery opened its gates to pilgrims or local dignitaries, its dark, viscous appearance promising warmth and cheer. A mainstream historical fact is that strong ales were often aged longer, allowing for deeper flavors and improved preservation, making them valuable for trade or long journeys. Then came the middle-tier brews, often simply referred to as table beer or common ale. This was the workhorse, the everyday drink for most of the monks. It had a moderate alcohol content, perhaps 3 to 5% ABV, similar to many modern session beers. It provided good calories and hydration without leading to significant intoxication, allowing the monks to perform their demanding duties throughout the day. This was the beer you'd be served most often, a dependable, nourishing beverage that fueled prayers, studies, and manual labor alike. Its taste would be robust, probably cloudy, and definitely lacking the crisp carbonation we expect today. But the real unsung hero of monastic hydration was the small beer. This was the lowest in alcohol, often less than 1% ABV, sometimes barely more than flavored, boiled water. It was brewed from the second runnings of the mash, meaning that after the initial strong wort was drawn off, more water was added to the spent grains to extract any remaining sugars. This process yielded a thin, but still nutritious and, most importantly, safe beverage. Small beer was often given to children, the infirm, and was the primary liquid sustenance for all during the day, particularly when engaged in very strenuous activity or when large volumes were required. A quirky tidbit, small beer was so commonplace and low in alcohol that it was not typically subject to the same social or moral restrictions as stronger alcoholic beverages. It was seen as a foodstuff. You can imagine a particularly parched monk, back from hours in the fields under the midday sun, downing tankard after tankard of small beer without any concern for his sobriety, only for quenching his thirst and replenishing his energy. Historians still argue whether the perceived weakness of medieval beer was due to lower initial alcohol content, or if much of the alcohol simply evaporated over time due to poor storage methods. It's likely a combination, but the clear intent was to provide beverages suitable for constant, daily consumption. The careful hierarchy of beer strengths reveals the pragmatism of monastic life. It wasn't about perpetual drunkenness, but about providing the right liquid for the right need, ensuring both the spiritual and physical well-being of the community. You appreciate this nuanced approach, understanding that even in the monastic world, a good pint had different meanings depending on the time of day and the task at hand. As you delve deeper into the rhythms of monastic life, you begin to notice how the consumption of beer, while constant, wasn't entirely static. It ebbed and flowed with the liturgical calendar, bringing us to the fascinating intersection of faith and fermentation, fasting and feasting. The medieval monastic year was punctuated by periods of solemn abstinence and joyous celebration, and beer, remarkably, played a distinct role in both. You might assume that during times of fasting, all indulgence would cease, but the reality for monks, ever practical, was more complex. During periods of long fasting, such as the 40 days of Lent, Advent, or on specific vigils and ember days, the monastic diet became incredibly austere. Meat was strictly forbidden, as were rich foods, dairy products, and sometimes even eggs. Meals were reduced in frequency and portion size, focusing on simple, often bland fare like bread, vegetables, and fish. Yet, amidst this rigorous self-denial, beer was often still permitted, and in some cases, even increased in consumption. Why? Because, as we've discussed, it wasn't viewed primarily as an indulgence, but as a vital source of calories, hydration, and essential nutrients. When solid food was scarce or forbidden, beer became an even more critical component of survival. A mainstream historical fact is that liquid bread was a common concept, allowing monks to sustain themselves during fasts without collapsing from malnutrition. This practical exception highlights the profound difference in how medieval people perceived beer compared to modern alcoholic beverages. You might recall stories of monks undertaking a liquid fast during Lent, where their primary sustenance for weeks on end was specially brewed strong beer, an impressive feat of both piety and endurance. Then, there were the feasting periods. These were moments of immense joy and communal celebration, marking major holy days like Christmas, Easter, or the feast days of patron saints. On these occasions, the monastic kitchen would pull out all the stops. Richer foods, sometimes including meat and fine cheeses, would be prepared, and, of course, the beer flowed more freely, and often, the stronger beers were brought out from the cellars. The ale of grace we discussed earlier would make its appearance, enjoyed by monks and honored guests alike. These feasts were not just about spiritual rejoicing, they were also vital social events that strengthened the bonds within the community and with the outside world. You can almost hear the convivial chatter, the hearty laughter, and the clinking of tankards as the monks relaxed their austere discipline for a brief, joyous interlude. A quirky tidbit is that some monasteries even had specific recipes for festival beers that were brewed only for these grand occasions, sometimes incorporating exotic spices or unusual brewing methods to create a truly special brew. Historians still argue whether the allowance of beer during fasts was a practical concession to human weakness or a sophisticated understanding of its nutritional value in periods of dietary restriction. It's a fascinating debate, as it touches on the blend of spiritual aspiration and pragmatic survival that define monastic life. What is clear is that the flexibility in the rule, combined with the inherent properties of beer, allowed monks to navigate the challenging demands of their liturgical year without succumbing to debilitating hunger or illness. You find yourself appreciating this adaptive approach, realizing that medieval monastic life, while disciplined, was never rigidly impractical. It sought to balance the demands of the soul with the needs of the body, and in that balance, beer played a surprisingly central and constantly evolving role. Beyond its role as a fundamental foodstuff and safe hydration, medieval monastic beer often found its way into another crucial aspect of community life, the monastic medicine chest. In an era before modern pharmaceuticals, monasteries were often centers of healing, drawing upon ancient knowledge, herbal remedies, and practical experience. And in this rudimentary medical practice, beer was surprisingly versatile, serving as a base, a carrier, and sometimes even a remedy in itself. You might associate medicine with bitter potions and unpleasant concoctions, but sometimes the doctor's orders were a refreshing pint. Imagine the infirmary, a quiet, hushed room separate from the bustling daily life of the monastery. Here, the sick and the elderly would find comfort and care. The monastic infirmarian, often a skilled herbalist, would tend to ailments ranging from fevers and stomach upsets to broken bones and chronic aches. For many of these conditions, beer played a supporting role. It could be used to dilute potent herbal infusions, making them more palatable and easier to administer. The gentle carbonation, often still present in medieval ales, could even help to soothe upset stomachs, a kind of primitive Alka-Seltzer. A mainstream historical fact is that many medieval herbal remedies were administered in liquid form, and fermented beverages like beer or wine were frequently used as the solvent or base, not only for their palatability, but also for their preservative qualities. Consider a monk suffering from a fever or a debilitating cough. Instead of plain, potentially contaminated water, the infirmarian might prescribe a warmed ale infused with medicinal herbs like hyssop, chamomile, or mugwort. The warmth, the mild alcohol, and the properties of the herbs would work in concert to alleviate symptoms. For those recovering from illness, a particularly nourishing, often slightly stronger, beer might be prescribed to help rebuild strength and appetite. It was seen as a restorative tonic, packed with those vital B vitamins and calories. A quirky tidbit is that some monastic infirmaries even brewed a specific healing ale, distinct from their regular brews, that was lower in alcohol but exceptionally rich in nutrients and fortified with specific medicinal herbs known for their restorative properties. You might hear tales of a particularly grumpy old monk, renowned for his chronic complaints, whose only true solace came from his daily medicinal pint, swearing it cured all his woes. Historians still argue whether the perceived medicinal benefits of medieval beer were primarily due to its nutritional content, its hydrating properties, the alcohol acting as an analgesic, or simply the placebo effect within a holistic monastic approach to health. It's a complex interplay of factors. What is undeniable, however, is that beer was considered a legitimate part of the medieval pharmacopoeia. It was a safer liquid than water for mixing medicines. Its nutritional value aided recovery, and its mild sedative properties could offer comfort to the ailing. You see a monk carefully decanting a measure of dark ale into a small pot, stirring in a handful of dried herbs. This isn't just brewing. It's a centuries-old tradition of practical healing, where the very drink that fueled daily life also offered solace and recovery in times of sickness. The quiet hum of the infirmary, mingled with the faint aroma of warm, herbal ale, is a testament to the comprehensive role beer played in every facet of monastic existence. Having seen beer as sustenance and medicine, let's now explore a pivotal ingredient that revolutionized its character and longevity: the role of hops. For much of early medieval history, beers, particularly in Northern Europe, were brewed without hops. Instead, they relied on a mixture of herbs and spices known as grut to provide bitterness, flavor, and a degree of preservation. But the introduction of hops fundamentally changed the game, leading to a more stable, palatable, and long-lasting product. Imagine the taste of early medieval ale, probably quite sweet, perhaps a bit cloying, and with a short shelf life, it would spoil quickly, turning sour or flat within days. This is where hops entered the scene, slowly gaining prominence from the 8th or 9th centuries onwards, and becoming widespread by the 13th and 14th centuries. Hops, the dried flowers of the Humulus lupulus plant, provided several crucial benefits. Primarily, they contributed a distinctive bitterness that balanced the sweetness of the malt, creating a more refreshing and complex flavor profile. This is a mainstream historical fact. The widespread adoption of hops was a major turning point in brewing history, moving beer closer to the flavors we recognize today. But beyond flavor, hops offered something even more vital for medieval life: preservation. Hops contain natural antibacterial properties that inhibit the growth of spoilage microorganisms, allowing beer to remain fresh and drinkable for much longer periods. This was an enormous advantage, enabling monasteries to brew larger batches, store them for extended periods, and even transport them over greater distances for trade or to supply other monastic houses. You can imagine the satisfaction of a monastic brewer, no longer facing the frequent heartbreak of spoiled batches, thanks to this humble flower. A quirky tidbit is that initially, some areas resisted the use of hops, preferring the traditional Groot ales, viewing hopped beer as a foreign or less natural product. There were even Groot rights held by certain lords or towns, granting them monopolies on the sale of Groot, which created economic resistance to the spread of hops. You can almost hear an old monk grumbling about those newfangled hopped ales, clinging to the familiar, sweeter taste of Groot. Historians still argue whether the adoption of hops was primarily driven by economic factors, allowing for trade in larger scale production, or by a growing appreciation for its flavor and preservative qualities. It's a classic case of demand and supply interacting. As demand for more stable and transportable beer grew, the benefits of hops became undeniable. You might even see a portion of the monastic garden dedicated to cultivating hop vines, their leafy vines climbing trellises, signaling the plant's growing importance. The careful harvesting and drying of the hop cones would be another seasonal task, adding to the monks' already diverse agricultural duties. The introduction of hops was a quiet revolution, changing beer from a quickly perishable, purely local commodity into something with greater reach and longevity. It meant more consistent quality, less waste, and ultimately, a more reliable supply of that essential liquid sustenance for the monks. So, as you take your next sip of ale, imagine the subtle bitterness, knowing it's not just for taste, but a testament to centuries of brewing innovation that allowed monasteries to thrive and their beer to endure. While our focus has largely been on the monks and their robust consumption, it's crucial to acknowledge that brewing was far from an exclusively male domain. In fact, a significant and often underestimated contribution came from women and brewing. Curry. Before the widespread establishment of monastic and later commercial breweries, brewing was primarily a domestic activity. And guess who was typically in charge of the household? That's right, women. From grinding the grain to mashing and fermenting, brewing was very much a woman's chore, alongside baking and cooking, firmly rooted in the daily sustenance of the family. Imagine a bustling medieval household, not necessarily a grand castle, but a simple cottage. Here, the woman of the house, often called an alewife or brewster, would be meticulously preparing the family's daily brew. This was no casual hobby. It was a vital responsibility, ensuring the family had safe drinking water and essential calories. Her skills were honed over years, passed down through generations, making her an indispensable part of the domestic economy. This is a mainstream historical fact for centuries. Brewing was largely a female-dominated craft, essential for every household. Her reputation in the community might even depend on the quality of her ale, as good ale was a sign of a well-run home. As towns grew and commercial brewing began to emerge, women continued to play a significant role. Many operated small-scale commercial breweries out of their homes, selling their surplus ale to neighbors and travelers. You might picture a woman, distinguished by her high conical hat and perhaps a long staff, symbols that later became grotesquely distorted into the imagery of witches, standing outside her home, a sign displaying a tankard or a sheaf of barley, indicating that fresh ale was available. These were the early entrepreneurs of the brewing world. A quirky tidbit is that the pointed hat and broomstick, now associated with witches, were in some interpretations derived from the actual tools and attire of medieval alewives, The hat made them visible in crowded markets, and the broomstick marked their door as a place where fresh brew was ready. You might even imagine one of these industrious women, with a wry smile, shooing away a too eager customer, asserting her dominance over her carefully crafted brew. Historians still argue whether the decline of women's dominance in brewing was due to the increasing professionalization and industrialization of the craft, or a deliberate exclusion from profitable trades. As brewing moved from the household to larger, more capitalized operations, and as monasteries became major producers, the physical demands and capital requirements often shifted control into male hands. However, even within monasteries, while the monks were the primary brewers, lay sisters or women from nearby communities might have assisted with tasks like harvesting hops or preparing grain, especially in double monasteries or those with significant lay workforces. So, while the monastic brew house was indeed run by brothers, it existed within a wider medieval context where brewing was intimately tied to women's labor and expertise. You realize that the hearty ale you drink is not just the product of monastic dedication, but also, indirectly, the inheritor of centuries of female ingenuity and skill, a quiet legacy bubbling beneath the surface of every historical pint. Beyond their spiritual and educational roles, medieval monasteries were often sophisticated engines of commerce and production, making them veritable economic powerhouses. And at the heart of much of their financial might, particularly in regions unsuitable for viticulture, was brewing. The sheer scale of monastic brewing meant they weren't just producing for internal consumption, they were often significant suppliers of beer to the surrounding lay population, generating substantial income and fostering complex economic relationships. Imagine the monastic gates, not just as an entrance to a holy place, but as a hub of economic activity. Farmers would bring their grain to the monastery, not just as alms, but as trade for goods or services. Merchants would arrive, seeking to purchase large quantities of the monastery's renowned ale to sell in nearby towns or markets. The monastery's brew house, with its consistent output and reliable quality, especially after the adoption of hops, became a valuable asset, often far surpassing the economic output of individual brewsters. This is a mainstream historical fact. Many monasteries held significant land, controlled resources, and engaged in large-scale agricultural and artisanal production, with brewing often being a primary economic driver. The income generated from beer sales was vital. It funded the construction and maintenance of impressive monastic buildings, the churches, cloisters, and infirmaries that stand as testaments to their wealth. It supported the monks themselves, providing for their clothing, food beyond what they produced, and the books and parchment necessary for their scholarly pursuits. It also allowed monasteries to be significant charitable institutions, providing alms, food, and hospitality to the poor, pilgrims, and travelers, often using beer as part of these provisions. You might observe a long line of villagers patiently waiting at the monastic gate, not just for a handout, but to purchase the consistent, safe beer that the monastery provided, a welcome alternative to potentially unreliable local brews. A quirky tidbit, some monasteries even issued their own tokens, or forms of currency that could be exchanged for beer or other monastic goods within their immediate economic sphere, highlighting their self-sufficiency and economic influence. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for monastic brewing on such a grand scale was internal necessity, charitable outreach, or a strategic pursuit of economic power and self-sufficiency. It's likely a blend of all three. The internal need for safe liquid clearly drove initial production, but the realization of its value as a trade commodity quickly transformed many monasteries into major commercial enterprises. The monks, while bound by vows of poverty, understood the practical need for wealth to sustain their communities and fulfill their spiritual mission. You realize that the contemplative life of a monk was deeply intertwined with the practical realities of managing a large, productive estate. The scent of brewing ale wasn't just the aroma of daily sustenance, it was the smell of prosperity, flowing forth from the monastic gates, sustaining not just the monks within, but much of the surrounding economy as well. The clinking of coins exchanged for barrels of beer was as much a part of the monastic symphony as the chanting of vespers. The economic power generated by monastic brewing didn't simply stay within the monastery walls. It had a profound ripple effect, demonstrating how monastic traditions often influence broader society. We're now exploring how monastic expertise and methods extended beyond the monastery walls, shaping secular beer production and consumption in ways that continue to resonate even today. Monasteries weren't just isolated bastions of piety, they were often centers of innovation and best practices, and their influence on brewing was undeniable. Imagine a burgeoning medieval town where small-scale brewsters and individual households might produce their own ale, but the benchmark for quality and consistency often came from the nearby monastery. The sheer volume of monastic production, coupled with their detailed record-keeping and often superior access to resources and knowledge like the adoption of hops, meant their beer was often of a higher standard. This led to a kind of informal apprenticeship system. Lay brewers might seek advice from monastic brethren, or even observe their methods, slowly adopting improved techniques. This is a mainstream historical fact. Monastic breweries were often at the forefront of brewing innovation, setting standards for quality and efficiency that influenced the wider brewing landscape. Furthermore, when towns grew large enough to support commercial breweries separate from individual households, it was often the monastic model that they emulated. The design of their brew houses, the types of grains they used, and even the varieties of beer they produced could all bear the imprint of monastic influence. You might see a secular brewer newly setting up shop in a growing market, visiting the local abbey, ostensibly for spiritual guidance, but perhaps more keenly observing the flow of operations in the monastic brewhouse, noting the size of the kettles or the methods of fermentation. A quirky tidbit is that some monastic foundations were even established with explicit brewing privileges granted by royalty or local lords, giving them a legal monopoly or significant advantage in beer production and sale within their region, further solidifying their influence on the market. You can almost hear the grumbles of a small independent brewer trying to compete with a consistently superior and often cheaper monastic brew. Historians still argue whether the lasting legacy of monastic brewing lies more in their specific technical innovations or in their institutional model of large-scale, consistent production. It's a chicken or egg debate. Did their brewing techniques spread because they were good, or were they good because they were part of a well-organized, large-scale institution? Regardless, the impact was clear. The monastic emphasis on quality control, their understanding of long-term storage, especially with hops, and their ability to produce consistent batches meant that secular brewers often looked to them as exemplars. When you consider the vast quantities of beer consumed daily throughout medieval society, the influence of these organized, productive monastic enterprises becomes even more apparent. They didn't just provide for their own, they helped define the very nature of beer production and consumption for an entire continent. You realize that the very pint you might enjoy today, with its balanced bitterness and reliable quality, owes a quiet debt to those ancient monks who meticulously brewed within their cloistered walls, their methods gradually seeping out to shape the world beyond. Even with the marvel of hops and the growing sophistication of monastic breweries, one challenge remained a constant headache for medieval brewers: the challenges of preservation. Unlike our modern world, where refrigeration, pasteurization, and airtight containers are commonplace, the medieval period lacked these fundamental technologies. Keeping beer fresh and palatable for extended periods was a constant battle against spoilage, a race against time and microscopic enemies. Imagine the monastic cellar, cool and dark, but far from truly cold. Barrels of freshly brewed ale are stored there, awaiting consumption or transport, but lurking in the air, in the wood of the barrels, and even in the residual yeasts, were countless microorganisms ready to turn that delicious brew sour, vinegary, or simply flat and unappetizing. The absence of temperature control was the primary hurdle. Warm temperatures accelerate spoilage, allowing unwanted bacteria and wild yeast to flourish, rapidly degrading the beer's quality. This is a mainstream historical fact spoilage due to uncontrolled fermentation and bacterial contamination was a pervasive problem for all medieval food and drink producers, especially for liquids like beer. The fight against spoilage involved a range of strategies. As we discussed, hops were a game changer, their antibacterial properties significantly extending shelf life. Beyond that, cleanliness, as rudimentary as it was paramount. Thoroughly cleaning brewing equipment and barrels helped to minimize contamination, though true sterilization was impossible. The material of the containers also played a role. Wooden barrels, while porous and difficult to sterilize completely, were the best available option for large-scale storage and transport. You might see a monk meticulously scrubbing out a barrel, not just with water, but perhaps with hot ash or even a quick rinse of strong alcohol, hoping to sanitize it as best he could. A quirky tidbit is that some brewers would line their barrels with a thin layer of pitch or resin, creating a more impermeable barrier and further protecting the beer from oxidation and unwanted microorganisms. You can almost hear a seasoned cellarer complaining about a rogue barrel, blaming the stubborn, sour demons within. Historians still argue whether the common sour taste of medieval beer was an unavoidable consequence of poor preservation or an acquired preference by medieval palates. It's likely a bit of both. While brewers strived for consistency, some level of sourness or acidity was probably inevitable due to the lack of perfect microbial control. However, palates adapt, and what we might consider spoiled today might have been perfectly acceptable or even desirable in the medieval context. This constant struggle with preservation meant that most beer was consumed relatively fresh, and strong beers were often made even stronger to allow them to last longer. The higher alcohol content and residual sugars acted as natural preservatives. You appreciate the fragility of the entire brewing process, understanding that every successful batch was a minor victory against the forces of decay. The effort expended in simply keeping the beer drinkable highlights just how vital it was to medieval life. Without safe and reliable methods to preserve their liquid sustenance, the monastic ideal of self-sufficiency would have been far more difficult to achieve, making every perfectly preserved barrel a testament to resilience and ingenuity. After all this talk of brewing methods, nutritional value, and preservation challenges, a crucial question arises: what did it actually taste like? Let's imagine the taste of medieval ale. Forget everything you know about modern, crystal clear, carbonated lagers or even heavily hopped IPAs. The experience of drinking a medieval monastic ale would have been distinctly different, a sensory journey into a past where brewing was more rustic, less refined, but undeniably robust. Firstly, a mainstream historical fact is that medieval ale was almost universally unfiltered, rock. This means it would have been cloudy, even murky, with visible particles of yeast, spent grain, and perhaps even bits of herbs floating in it. Think of it more like a thick, savory broth than a clear beverage. The color would vary depending on the grains used and the roasting level of the malt, ranging from a pale straw to a dark, almost opaque brown. You'd lift the wooden or pottery mug to your lips, and the opacity alone would be a visual cue that this was a hearty, substantial drink. The aroma would be dominated by malt, a sweet, bready, sometimes slightly roasted scent. If hops were used, there would be an earthy, herbal, perhaps even subtly floral or resinous note, a far cry from the pungent citrus or pine aromas of many modern hops. Without modern temperature control during fermentation, wild yeast would often contribute a complex array of flavors, perhaps slightly fruity, sometimes a little sour or tart, what modern brewers would call off flavors, but were likely common and accepted then, and occasionally a hint of something earthy or farm-like. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval recipes mention adding spices like ginger, cinnamon, or even unusual ingredients like bay leaves or pine needles to their brews, which would have added yet another layer to the taste profile, making each monastery's brew uniquely its own. You might even catch a faint, almost yeasty tang, a signature of the wild fermentation that predominated. As for the mouthfeel, it would likely be full-bodied, perhaps a bit viscous, and with minimal carbonation compared to today's fizzy drinks. The natural carbonation produced during fermentation would have mostly dissipated, resulting in a relatively flat texture. The primary taste would be sweet from the residual sugars, balanced by whatever bitterness came from Grutter hops. There might be a subtle underlying sourness, too, as previously discussed, due to less controlled fermentation and preservation. Historians still argue whether the presence of a slight sourness in medieval beer was an unavoidable byproduct of the brewing process or an intentionally cultivated characteristic, akin to modern sour beers. It's a fascinating thought. Perhaps what we consider a flaw was once a cherished nuance. You take a sip, it's warm, perhaps slightly grainy, undeniably nourishing. The sweetness of the malt hits first, followed by an earthy bitterness. There's a lingering, bready aftertaste. This isn't a drink for delicate palates. It's a utilitarian, robust beverage designed to fill the stomach, quench the thirst, and provide sustenance. It's the taste of hard work, of self-sufficiency, and of a world where necessity truly was the mother of invention. The subtle differences between one monastery's brew and another's would have been keenly noted by travelers and monks alike, a silent testament to the individuality of each community's particular methods and local ingredients. This medieval ale, in all its cloudy, malty, sometimes sour glory, was the everyday reality for centuries, a taste of history itself. While our journey has been deeply embedded within the monastic walls, it's vital to broaden our perspective and recognize that the high consumption of beer wasn't confined to robed figures and solemn cloisters. Indeed, it was a pervasive characteristic of medieval life across the board, not just monks. From the humblest peasant to the wealthiest noble, from the bustling marketplace to the quietest village, beer was the common drink, a central pillar of the medieval diet for virtually everyone. Imagine the daily life of a medieval peasant. Their diet was often meager, largely consisting of grains, vegetables, and sometimes a bit of cheese or fish. Meat was a rare luxury for these hard-working individuals, often engaged in back-breaking agricultural labor from dawn till dusk. Beer was an indispensable source of calories and hydration. They might not have had a dedicated monastic brewhouse, but brewing was a common household chore, typically performed by the women of the family, as we touched upon earlier. A mainstream historical fact is that the average medieval person, regardless of social standing, drank significant quantities of beer daily, often exceeding what we would consider healthy today for alcoholic beverages. Even at the highest echelons of society, beer held its place. While nobles and royalty certainly had access to wine, which was often seen as a drink of prestige, beer remained a staple. Servants, soldiers, and even the lord and lady themselves would consume beer regularly, especially the stronger, higher quality brews. It was served at feasts, in taverns, and in private homes. You might picture a bustling medieval tavern filled with boisterous laughter and the clinking of tankards, where peasants, merchants, and even knights might gather, all united by their common enjoyment of ale. A quirky tidbit in some medieval castles. Specific allowances of beer were part of a knight's or soldier's daily wages or rations, underscoring its role as a fundamental provision. You could almost hear a weary knight, after a long day of training or travel, exclaim, "By the saints, I'm parched. Bring me a tankard and make it a good one." Historians still argue whether the universal acceptance and high consumption of beer in the Middle Ages was due to a lack of viable alternatives, its inherent nutritional value, or a cultural preference that developed over centuries. It's probably all of the above. The lack of safe drinking water, coupled with beer's caloric density and its accidental purification through brewing, made it an incredibly practical and reliable beverage. Over generations, its consumption became deeply ingrained in the cultural fabric, a daily ritual from cradle to grave. So, while monks represent a particularly well-documented case study due to their meticulous record-keeping, remember that their relationship with beer was merely an amplification of a much broader societal trend. You realize that the medieval world literally ran on beer, not just the pious dedication of its monks, but the tireless labor of its peasants and the daily routines of its nobles. It was the universal solvent, the common denominator, flowing through every aspect of life in an age before purified water. Now that we've firmly established beer's universal presence, let's get down to the brass tacks, or rather, the copper kettles and wooden paddles. What did the actual process look like? We delve into the tools of the trade, brewing equipment. While the scale and sophistication varied, the fundamental apparatus remained surprisingly consistent, relying on ingenuity and readily available materials rather than advanced technology. You're about to imagine yourself not just drinking the beer, but crafting it with your own hands, using the rudimentary but effective implements of the medieval monastic brewhouse. Imagine standing amidst the organized chaos of the monastic brewhouse. The most striking pieces of equipment are undoubtedly the musser, large copper or iron kettles. These massive vessels, often heated directly over roaring wood fires, were essential for boiling the wort. Copper was prized for its excellent heat conductivity, though iron might also be used. A mainstream historical fact is that the development of large metal brewing kettles was a significant advancement, allowing for more efficient heat transfer in larger batch sizes than earlier methods involving heated stones or clay pots. You'd feel the intense heat radiating from them, the air thick with steam and the sweet, malty scent of the boiling liquid. Next, you'd notice the shimashtan, typically a large wooden vat or barrel. This is where the crushed malted grain would be steeped in hot water. These tons often had a false bottom, a perforated plate that allowed the sugary liquid wort to drain away while retaining the spent grains. Stirring the mash was a critical step, and for this, long, sturdy, wooden paddles were indispensable. These paddles, often several feet long, allowed the brewers to agitate the thick, grainy mixture, ensuring even temperature and efficient sugar extraction. You can almost feel the strain in your arms, pushing and pulling the heavy paddle through the viscous mash. A quirky tidbit is that some monastic brewers would use particularly old, seasoned wooden mash tuns, believing that the microbes embedded in the wood contributed to the unique character of their monastery's specific brew, a kind of primitive house culture before anyone understood microbiology. You might see a senior monk patting his favorite paddle as if it were an old friend, knowing its every warp and groove. For fermentation, large wooden fermentation vats or barrels were used. These were simply cleaned, often unlined, containers where the cooled wort would be transferred and left to ferment. Smaller wooden barrels or casks were then used for storage and transport, ranging in size from personal daily rations to massive barrels for trade. The sealing of these barrels, often with wooden bungs hammered into place, was crucial for keeping air out and preventing spoilage, although perfection was rarely achieved. Lastly, simple strainers, ladles, and buckets, all likely made of wood, pottery, or rudimentary metal, completed the essential toolkit. These basic tools, combined with empirical knowledge and tireless effort, allowed medieval monks to produce vast quantities of a vital beverage. Historians still argue whether the apparent uniformity in brewing equipment across different regions was due to shared knowledge, practical limitations of available materials, or a combination of both. Regardless, stepping into that monastic brewhouse, you realize that the craft of brewing, then as now, relied on fundamental principles, applied with resourcefulness and dedication. Every piece of equipment, from the mighty kettle to the humble paddle, played its part in sustaining a civilization. Having explored the monastic brewhouse and its basic equipment, let's now delve into the very foundation of beer itself, the grain, specifically the crucial process known as the art of malting. Before barley or any other cereal grain can become beer, it must first be malted. This isn't just a preparatory step. It's a carefully controlled, almost magical transformation that unlocks the sugars essential for fermentation. Without proper malting, there would be no beer as we know it, just a bland, starchy gruel. Imagine the malt house, often a separate, well-ventilated building within the monastic compound. Here, large quantities of raw grain, typically barley, are brought in. The first step in malting is steeping. Can I? The grains are soaked in water for a period, often a day or two, until they are fully saturated and begin to absorb moisture. This rehydrates the dormant barley kernels and kickstarts the germination process. You might see vast wooden troughs filled with water and grain, the surface bubbling slightly as the kernels begin to swell. This initial steeping is a mainstream historical fact, an ancient technique essential for awakening the grain. Once steeped, the grains are spread out on a malting floor, a large open space, often paved with stone or wood, in shallow beds. This is where the magic of germination occurs. The moist, warm environment encourages the barley to sprout, much like it would if planted in a field. As the grain begins to grow, enzymes within the kernel are activated. These enzymes are the unsung heroes of brewing. Their job is to break down the complex starches within the barley into simpler sugars, primarily maltose, which the yeast can then ferment into alcohol. The malters, often lay brothers or hired hands, would constantly turn the sprouting grain with wooden shovels or rakes to prevent matting, ensure even germination, and regulate temperature. This turning prevents mold growth and allows for uniform development. A quirky tidbit is that the particular type of floor in the malt house, the ambient humidity, and even the subtle variations in temperature could contribute unique characteristics to the resulting malt, subtly influencing the final beer. You can almost feel the springy warm carpet of sprouting grain underfoot, emitting a sweet, earthy scent. Finally, at the precise moment when the enzymatic activity is at its peak, and before the sprouts consume too much of the precious starch, the germination process is halted through kilning. The green malt is transferred to a kiln, a large oven or chamber where it is gently heated. The heat dries the malt, preventing further growth, and crucially, develops its color and flavor. Different temperatures and durations of kilning produce different types of malt, from pale malts that yield lighter beers to darker, more roasted malts that contribute caramel or chocolate notes. This kilning process is critical for the malt's character and stability. Historians still argue whether the precise timing of kilning, particularly in pre-thermometer eras, was based on empirical observation, long-standing tradition, or a combination of both. It was undoubtedly an art form, passed down through generations of malters, relying on sight, smell, and touch to determine when the malt was just right. The sweet, toasty aroma drifting from the monastic malt house would have been a comforting and familiar smell, a precursor to the delicious ale soon to be brewed. You recognize that this seemingly simple process of tricking a grain into growing, then stopping it, is the fundamental starting point for every single pint of beer consumed, a silent testament to ancient agricultural and proto-scientific wisdom. While barley was undeniably the king of grains in medieval brewing, it wasn't the sole performer in the monastic brewhouse. The medieval brewer, much like a modern chef, understood that different ingredients brought different qualities to the table. This leads us to explore the varieties of grain used for brewing and how regional availability and specific desired characteristics influence the monk's choice of raw materials. The taste, color, and body of the ale could vary significantly depending on what went into the mash tun. Barley, particularly two-row barley, was the preferred grain for malting across much of Europe due to its high starch content and its husks, which naturally aid in the lautering process by forming a filter bed. Its reliable performance made it the default choice for producing the consistent, nourishing ales that form the backbone of the monastic diet. This is a mainstream historical fact. Barley has been the primary grain for beer production for millennia, and its suitability for malting is a key reason for its dominance. You'd see vast sacks of it, freshly delivered from the monastic fields or purchased from local farmers, stacked high in the storerooms, awaiting its transformation. However, other grains often found their way into the monastic mash. Oats, for instance, were frequently used, particularly in northern regions. They contribute a smooth, creamy mouthfeel to beer and can add a subtle nutty flavor. While they don't have a husk like barley, requiring more careful lautering, their availability and ability to thrive in cooler climates made them a practical addition. You might imagine a particularly innovative monastic brewer experimenting with a higher proportion of oats, aiming for a richer, more comforting brew for the colder months. A quirky tidbit sometimes, ancient grains like spelt or emmer, remnants of earlier agricultural practices, might have been used, especially in more isolated or traditional monasteries, lending a unique and perhaps unreplicable character to their brews. You could almost envision a wise old monk, perhaps a bit of a connoisseur, discerning the subtle differences in an ale brewed with a touch of local rye versus one purely of barley. Wheat was another significant grain, especially in certain regions or for specific styles of ale. Wheat beers tend to be lighter in color, often with a hazier appearance, remember. Medieval beers were largely unfiltered and can impart a tartness or a delicate fruitiness, especially when fermented with specific yeast strains. However, wheat's lack of a husk made lautering more challenging, often requiring the addition of barley husks or a straw filter to prevent a stuck mash. Rye was also occasionally used, bringing a spicy, earthy, or peppery note to the beer, though it could also make the mash notoriously sticky and difficult to work with. Historians still argue whether the choice of secondary grains was primarily driven by agricultural practicality, what grew best locally, flavor preferences, or specific nutritional needs unique to certain monastic diets. It was likely a complex interplay of these factors. The monastic brewer, therefore, was not just a master of one grain, but often an artisan adept at blending different cereals, understanding their unique contributions to the final product. This intelligent use of varieties of grain allowed for a spectrum of monastic ales, from the hearty everyday barley brew to the occasional specialty ale, perhaps with oats for smoothness or wheat for a lighter touch, each tailored to the needs, resources, and even the subtle culinary ambitions of the particular monastic community. It's a testament to their deep connection with the land and their pragmatic approach to sustenance. Beyond the foundational grains and the critical hops, the medieval monastic brewer often looked to another source for enhancing their ales, the monastery's own cultivated lands. This brings us to the fascinating connection between the brewery and the Rot monastic gardens. These weren't just pretty patches of flowers. They were meticulously planned and cultivated spaces, providing food, medicinal herbs, and often subtle flavorings for the monastery's daily brew. Imagine the monastic garden, a vibrant tapestry of green, often laid out in a logical, ordered fashion, reflecting the monk's disciplined approach to all aspects of life. While a significant portion would be dedicated to vegetables and herbs for cooking and medicine, a section might also be set aside for plants that could contribute to brewing. Before hops became universally dominant, and even after, certain herbs and spices were routinely added to beer as part of the Groot mixture, or simply as individual flavorings. This is a mainstream historical fact. Medieval beers were often flavored with a wide array of botanicals, reflecting regional traditions and available flora. Consider some of the ingredients you might find here that could end up in a monastic ale. Mugwort, for instance, was a common Groot ingredient, lending a bitter, aromatic quality. Yarrow. Another traditional Groot herb was believed to enhance the intoxicating effects of beer and contribute a slightly spicy flavor. Other additions might include heather, bog myrtle, or even more exotic spices like coriander or ginger. If the monastery had access to trade routes, these wouldn't necessarily be added in large quantities, but rather in subtle amounts to impart a unique character or perceived medicinal benefit to the brew. You might see a lay brother, carefully pruning a patch of mugwort, knowing that its harvest will soon find its way into the bubbling wort. A quirky tidbit is that some monastic garden designs even incorporated specific brewers' plots, where these very particular herbs were cultivated separately, highlighting their importance to the brewery. You could almost hear a senior monk, with a twinkle in his eye, describing the secret ingredient that made their abbey's ale so renowned: a closely guarded blend of garden herbs. Historians still argue whether the use of specific garden herbs in monastic brewing was primarily for flavor, for their perceived medicinal properties, or simply as a way to distinguish one monastery's beer from another's. It was likely a combination of these. The perceived health benefits of certain herbs would have made them attractive additions, especially for the healing ales we discussed earlier. But also, developing a unique, recognizable taste could enhance a monastery's reputation and commercial appeal. The monastic gardens, therefore, were not merely decorative or purely functional. They were an extension of the monastic ethos of self-sufficiency and careful stewardship of resources. Every plant had a purpose, and many of those purposes ultimately converged in the frothing vats of the brewhouse. The subtle interplay of homegrown botanicals with the malt and hops created a complex tapestry of flavors, making each monastic ale a true product of its environment and the dedicated hands that tended both the garden and the brew. As we've traversed the medieval monastic landscape, one constant, underlying concern has permeated every aspect of daily life, from simply quenching thirst to brewing the daily ale. Water quality matters. Even though beer offered a far safer alternative, the initial source of water for brewing was still of paramount importance. The quality of the water directly influenced the efficiency of the brewing process, the taste of the final product, and, perhaps less directly, the health of those consuming it, even after boiling. Imagine the monk's careful consideration when choosing a location for a new monastery, or when digging a new well within an existing one. Proximity to a reliable, clean water source was as crucial as fertile land or access to building materials. Monasteries were often established near natural springs, known for their purity, or alongside rivers that, while potentially polluted downstream by human settlements, might offer cleaner water upstream near the monastery's intake point. This foresight in selecting a water source was a mainstream historical fact, showcasing a practical understanding of resource management long before germ theory. You can picture the satisfaction of a monastic community boasting of its sweet water spring, a source of pride, and a key ingredient in their renowned ale. Even with a seemingly good source, the monks would have noticed subtle variations. Hard water, rich in minerals like calcium and magnesium, would have interacted differently with the grains during mashing, potentially affecting pH levels and enzyme activity. Softer water, while less mineral-rich, might have produced a different flavor profile. While they lack the scientific tools to analyze water chemistry, experienced brewers would have developed an empirical understanding of their water source and adapted their brewing methods accordingly. A quirky tidbit is that some monastic brewing records include specific instructions for adjusting the grain bill or mashing temperatures based on the perceived hardness or softness of the water from different wells or seasons, demonstrating a keen, albeit unscientific, awareness of water's impact. You might even hear a seasoned brewer grumble about a stubborn batch of water, implying it was somehow resisting the proper transformation. Historians still argue whether the accidental discovery of certain regional beer styles like the distinct taste of Pilsner or Dublin Stout was primarily due to the unique mineral composition of local water sources or later deliberate recipe development. While modern brewers meticulously adjust water profiles, medieval brewers were simply working with what nature provided, and those natural variations undoubtedly contributed to the regional diversity of medieval ales. The importance of water quality matters. Wasn't just about avoiding illness in the raw state, it was about optimizing the brewing process itself. The better the water, the more efficient the sugar extraction from the malt, and often, the cleaner and more consistent the resulting beer. So, as you reflect on the medieval monk's daily pint, Remember that even in a world where water was inherently dangerous, the pursuit of the best available water was a quiet, yet persistent, quest that laid the groundwork for their legendary brews. The purity of the source, ironically, was key even when the end product was a fermented beverage. Stepping further into the broader medieval world, it becomes clear that beer wasn't just a universal drink. Its quality and availability could often be a subtle, yet significant, indicator of one's place in the social hierarchy. This brings us to beer and social status, a fascinating dynamic where the type of ale you drank and how much of it often reflected your wealth, profession, or even your moral standing. Imagine the stratified layers of medieval society, from the lowest peasant to the highest noble. While everyone drank beer, the kind of beer varied considerably. The common peasant, as we've discussed, would mostly consume small beer, a thin, low-alcohol brew made from the second or third runnings of the mash. It was sustenance, pure and simple, often brewed at home or purchased from a local alewife. This was the cheapest and most readily available option, reflecting their limited means. This is a mainstream historical fact. Social standing in medieval society was often reflected in access to higher quality and more expensive food and drink. As you ascend the social ladder, the quality of the beer improved. Merchants, skilled artisans, and lower clergy might have access to better quality table beer or common ale, brews with more body, better flavor, and a slightly higher alcohol content. These were often purchased from more established commercial breweries or, in the case of monasteries, were the standard daily fare for the monks themselves. You might observe a group of prosperous guild members, meeting in a bustling tavern, ordering tankards of a heartier, richer ale, their conversation punctuated by the satisfied clink of ceramic on wood. A quirky tidbit is that in some medieval households of the wealthy, specific types of beer were brewed or purchased for different ranks of servants, with the highest quality reserved for the lord's table and the lower qualities for the scullery maids and stable hands. You could almost hear a cook grumbling about having to serve the thin stuff to the kitchen boys, while the master's table enjoyed the rich, dark ale. At the very pinnacle of society, among the nobility and high-ranking clergy, you'd find the consumption of the finest and strongest ales, often referred to as strong ale or ale of grace. These were brewed with more malt, sometimes with more hops, and aged longer. They were expensive, coveted, and a symbol of hospitality and prosperity. While wine was also a prestige drink, particularly in wine-producing regions, a fine, well-aged ale held its own. These strong ales would be served at lavish feasts, accompanying rich meats and delicate pastries, a testament to the host's wealth and generosity. Historians still argue whether the social stratification of beer consumption reflected an actual taste preference among the elite or simply a display of wealth through access to more resource-intensive brews. It's a chicken or egg situation. Did they truly prefer the stronger, richer ales, or did they drink them because they could bow? Regardless, the pattern was clear. So, while beer was omnipresent, its variations silently spoke volumes about the drinker's place in the medieval world. The monastic daily ration of several liters of often strong, or at least robust ale, therefore placed them squarely in the middle to upper echelons of medieval society in terms of liquid sustenance. Their consistent access to quality brews underscored their wealth, organization, and self-sufficiency, painting a vivid picture of a world where even a humble pint could tell a powerful story about beer and social status. And as medieval society became more complex and urban centers grew, so too did the need for order and standardization, even in something as fundamental as brewing. This brings us to the emergence of one regulations and guilds, forces that began to shape the brewing industry, influencing everything from the quality of the beer to the rights of the brewers. While monasteries operated under their own rules, the secular brewing world increasingly found itself subject to external oversight, a precursor to modern food and safety standards. Imagine a bustling medieval town, where numerous small-scale brewsters and emerging commercial breweries compete for customers. Without oversight, quality could vary wildly, and unscrupulous brewers might cut corners, using inferior ingredients or unsanitary practices. This led to calls for regulation, often initiated by local authorities or, more influentially, by the brewers themselves. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval towns and cities often implemented strict laws concerning the production and sale of beer, regulating everything from prices and measures to ingredients and brewing methods, all aimed at protecting consumers and ensuring fair trade. You might see a town crier announcing a new ordinance regarding the assize of ale, dictating the price and quality of beer available for sale. This desire for order also led to the formation of brewers' guilds. These were associations of brewers, much like modern trade unions or professional organizations. Guilds served multiple purposes. They protected the interests of their members, often by limiting competition. They set standards for quality and craftsmanship, ensuring a certain level of skill and integrity among guild members, and they provided mutual support and training for apprentices. Becoming a master brewer in a guild meant years of apprenticeship and rigorous examination, ensuring that only skilled individuals produced beer for public consumption. A quirky tidbit is that some guilds had elaborate rituals and secret recipes that were only shared among initiated members, adding an air of mystique and exclusivity to the craft. You could almost envision a serious, stout guild master inspecting a batch of ale with a critical eye, his reputation and that of his guild hanging on every sip. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for the formation of brewers' guilds was economic protectionism for their members or a genuine desire to ensure public health and quality standards. It was likely a blend of both. Guilds certainly benefited their members by creating monopolies and controlling prices, but they also played a crucial role in standardizing practices and preventing widespread fraud or dangerous brewing. While monasteries, with their established reputations and internal discipline, were often exempt from direct guild control, their high standards undoubtedly served as an informal benchmark for quality. You realize that the very stability and consistency of the monastic brew might have inadvertently pushed secular brewers towards forming these regulatory bodies, as they sought to compete and gain public trust. The medieval world, though seemingly chaotic, was constantly striving for order, and in the case of beer, this led to the organized power of guilds and the increasing oversight of town authorities, slowly but surely shaping the brewing landscape for centuries to come. Our journey through medieval monastic brewing has so far focused on steady routines and gradual evolutions, but history, as always, is punctuated by cataclysmic events that reshape everything. One such event, the devastating plague that swept across Europe, profoundly impacted every aspect of life, including the production and consumption of beer. We're talking about punning, the Black Death's impact. This horrific pandemic, peaking in the mid-14th century, didn't just decimate populations. It fundamentally altered social structures, labor, and ultimately, even how monks brewed their daily ale. Imagine the sheer terror and chaos as the plague spread. Villages emptied, fields lay fallow, and monasteries, despite their isolation, were far from immune. The monastic communities, with their close living quarters, were particularly vulnerable. Monks, infirmarians, and lay brothers perished in vast numbers. This widespread mortality had an immediate and drastic effect on the brewhouse. A mainstream historical fact is that the Black Death led to a severe labor shortage across Europe, impacting every industry, including brewing. Fewer hands meant less capacity for brewing, and the specialized knowledge of experienced brewers was often lost with their lives. You can picture the once bustling brew house, now eerily quiet, with only a handful of remaining monks struggling to maintain production. The economic consequences were equally profound. With a drastically reduced population, demand for certain goods might have lessened, but the need for basic sustenance, including beer, remained. However, the cost of labor skyrocketed, making it more expensive to grow grain, transport it, and brew. Monasteries, which relied on both their own labor and hired hands, would have faced immense pressure to maintain their brewing operations. This period also saw shifts in land use, as less labor meant some arable land might have reverted to pasture, potentially affecting the availability and price of brewing grains. A quirky tidbit is that some historians speculate that the Black Death's impact on population density might have inadvertently led to slightly cleaner water sources in some areas, as urban populations dwindled, though the overall reliance on beer for safe hydration persisted. You might hear the somber tolling of the monastery bell, marking another death, each chime a stark reminder of the fragile balance of their existence. Historians still argue whether the long-term effect of the Black Death on brewing was primarily negative, leading to a decline in quality, or whether it forced innovations and greater efficiency in production. While the immediate impact was undoubtedly disruptive, the labor shortage might have incentivized brewers to develop more efficient techniques or invest in larger, more productive equipment if they could afford it. It also led to greater social mobility for surviving laborers, who could demand higher wages. For monasteries, it likely meant a period of intense struggle to maintain their self-sufficiency, often having to rely more heavily on what remained of their land and their diminished brotherhood. The very nature of their existence, previously so stable, was shaken to its core. The Black Death, therefore, was not just a historical tragedy. It was a powerful catalyst for change, forcing even the most traditional institutions like the monastic breweries to adapt or perish, leaving an indelible mark on the history of beer, much like a dark stain on a beloved old brewing ledger. Beyond the bubbling vats and steaming mash tuns, another crucial, yet quieter aspect of monastic life played an invaluable role in the history of brewing the monastery's intellectual heart. Its monastery libraries. These repositories of knowledge, painstakingly compiled and preserved through centuries of monastic scholarship, weren't just filled with theological treatises and biblical texts. They also contained practical guides, agricultural records, and even rudimentary recipes that documented brewing practices. These libraries were the silent guardians of brewing knowledge, ensuring its continuity and evolution. Imagine the scriptorium, a quiet room bathed in the soft light from arched windows, where monks diligently copied manuscripts, preserving ancient wisdom and contemporary observations. It was here, amidst illuminated texts and scholarly commentaries, that practical knowledge about brewing, farming, and even rudimentary science was meticulously recorded. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval monasteries were often the primary centers for literacy and book production in Europe, preserving vast amounts of knowledge that would otherwise have been lost during periods of instability. You can picture a monk, quill in hand, not only transcribing scripture, but also carefully noting down the optimal malting temperatures, the best time to harvest hops, or the ideal proportions of grain for a particularly successful brew. These monastic texts might not have been formal brewing manuals as we understand them today, but rather collections of observations, instructions, and even anecdotes passed down through generations of monastic brewers. They would detail the rule of thumb measurements, the seasonal variations, and the specific characteristics of local ingredients. This accumulated knowledge, safeguarded within the library walls, was vital for ensuring consistency and quality in an era without standardized measurements or scientific understanding of microbiology. A quirky tidbit is that some monastic libraries contain detailed drawings or even rudimentary blueprints of brew houses and malting floors, offering invaluable insights into the architecture and layout of these vital operations. You could almost envision a young novitiate tasked with assisting in the brewhouse, poring over an ancient, leather-bound book, trying to decipher the cryptic instructions for a particularly tricky mash. Historians still argue whether the knowledge contained in monastic libraries was primarily empirical based on observation and trial and error, or if there was a more theoretical, albeit pre-scientific, understanding of the brewing process. It was undoubtedly a blend of both. Practical experience was paramount, but the act of recording and transmitting that experience through written texts allowed for a more systematic approach in the accumulation of knowledge over generations. The monastic libraries, therefore, served as the collective memory of the monastic brewing tradition. They ensured that successful techniques weren't forgotten, that lessons learned from past failures were preserved, and that new innovations, however incremental, could be documented and shared within the monastic network. So, as you reflect on the consistent quality of monastic ale, remember that behind every frothing pint was not just the toil of the brewers, but the quiet dedication of the scribes and scholars who meticulously preserved the monastery libraries. The unsung intellectual powerhouses of medieval brewing. Just as the Black Death irrevocably altered the medieval landscape, another monumental shift, centuries later, profoundly reshaped the role of monastic institutions and, by extension, their brewing prowess. This brings us to Reformation's influence. A period of intense religious and political upheaval in 16th century Europe that had far-reaching consequences for the very existence of monasteries and their once dominant breweries. Imagine the simmering tensions across Europe as theological debates challenged the authority of the Catholic Church. Figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin sparked movements that led to the establishment of Protestantism, which often fundamentally disagreed with the monastic way of life. Many reformers viewed monasteries as corrupt, overly wealthy, and unproductive, diverting resources that could be better used elsewhere. This ideological clash led to widespread actions that directly impacted monastic breweries. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Protestant Reformation led to the dissolution of countless monasteries across Northern Europe, particularly in England under Henry VIII, and in parts of Germany and Scandinavia. The dissolution of monasteries meant the seizure of their lands, assets, and properties by secular rulers. Monastic breweries, once thriving economic powerhouses, were often shut down, their equipment sold off, and their skilled brewers dispersed. The centuries-old traditions and specific brewing methods developed within those walls were abruptly interrupted, and in many cases, completely lost. You can picture the once bustling monastic brewhouse, now silent and abandoned. Its copper kettles perhaps melted down for other uses, its wooden barrels rotting. A quirky tidbit is that while many monastic breweries were dissolved, some, particularly in Catholic regions, that remained untouched by the Reformation's fervor, like parts of Belgium and Bavaria, actually saw their brewing traditions strengthen and even flourish in response, becoming bastions of Catholic identity and economic self-sufficiency. You might even hear the lament of a former monastic brewer, now a layperson, mourning the loss of his beloved brew house and the unique ale it once produced. Historians still argue whether the long-term impact of the Reformation on European brewing was primarily a net loss of traditional brewing knowledge, or if it simply shifted the center of brewing innovation from monastic institutions to secular, commercial breweries. While an immense amount of specific monastic brewing heritage was undoubtedly lost, the market vacuum created by their dissolution often spurred the growth of independent, commercial breweries. These new enterprises, freed from monastic vows and focused purely on profit, could sometimes be more agile and innovative in their pursuit of market share. The Reformation effectively severed the direct link between monastic life and large-scale brewing in many parts of Europe, ushering in a new era where secular brewers, rather than pious monks, would dominate the industry. You realize that the very spiritual fervor that sought to purify the church also inadvertently poured cold water on centuries of brewing tradition, leading to both significant loss and, ironically, new opportunities for the burgeoning commercial brewing world. The landscape of beer was irrevocably altered, moving from the cloister to the marketplace. Despite the seismic shifts brought about by the Reformation, the legacy of monastic brewing didn't vanish entirely into the annals of history. In fact, many modern breweries, particularly those renowned for their traditional styles, can trace their lineage directly or indirectly back to those ancient monastic roots. This brings us to the fascinating continuity of the monastic influence. From monastery to brewery, the techniques, recipes, and even the very spirit of monastic brewing continue to inform and inspire today's craft beer scene. Imagine walking through the hallowed halls of a centuries-old European brewery, one famous for its rich, complex ales. You might notice architectural details, names, or even specific brewing practices that harken back to monastic traditions. This isn't coincidence. A mainstream historical fact is that several renowned European breweries, particularly in Belgium and Germany, either directly originated from monastic foundations that survived the Reformation or were established on the sites of former monasteries, inheriting their brewing infrastructure and often their traditional recipes. Think of the Trappist breweries of Belgium, still operated by monks under strict monastic rules, producing some of the world's most revered beers. These are living links to the past, continuously brewing according to traditions refined over centuries. Even for breweries without a direct monastic lineage, the influence is often clear. The monastic emphasis on quality ingredients, meticulous process, and the production of nourishing, flavorful ales became an enduring standard. Many traditional styles, from strong abbey ales to robust dark lagers, carry the DNA of monastic brewing. Modern craft brewers, in their quest for authenticity and historical accuracy, often study ancient monastic records and adapt historical techniques, trying to recreate the tastes and textures of these storied brews. You might see a modern brewer, with a thoughtful expression, discussing the importance of bottle conditioning, a technique where fermentation finishes in the bottle, producing natural carbonation and often a richer flavor, a practice directly descended from medieval monastic methods of storing and aging beer. A quirky tidbit is that some modern breweries deliberately incorporate names, symbols, or even the Latin phrases from monastic life into their branding, a conscious nod to this rich historical heritage, even if they have no direct historical link to a monastery themselves. You could almost feel the weight of history in your hand as you sip a double or triple, knowing it's a direct descendant of a monastic brew. Historians still argue whether the resurgence of interest in monastic-style beers in modern times is a romanticization of the past or a genuine appreciation for the quality and complexity of these traditional brews. It's likely both. There's an undeniable allure to the idea of a product crafted with centuries of tradition and spiritual dedication. But beyond the romance, the quality and unique character of these beers speak for themselves. The rigorous standards, the focus on natural ingredients, and the dedication to craftsmanship that define monastic brewing continue to be highly valued in today's sophisticated beer market. So, as you enjoy your next craft beer, perhaps a rich, malty ale with a hint of something complex, remember that its very existence, its nuanced flavors, and its dedication to quality owe a significant debt to the quiet, diligent work of monks, whose journey from monastery to brewery shaped the very foundations of the brewing world we know today. We've journeyed through the rise and enduring influence of monastic brewing, but like all eras, its period of dominance eventually waned. This brings us to the end of an era, a gradual decline of monastic breweries as the primary centers of beer production and innovation. It wasn't a sudden collapse everywhere, but a slow shift, driven by changing economies, new technologies, and evolving societal structures. Imagine the brewing landscape transitioning from the medieval period into the early modern age. Monasteries, while still important, faced increasing competition from secular commercial breweries. These new enterprises, often established in growing towns and cities, were driven by profit motives and less constrained by the internal rules and religious obligations of a monastery. They could be more agile, quicker to adopt new technologies, and more focused on market trends than a monastic brewhouse primarily designed for internal sustenance. This is a mainstream historical fact: the growth of secular commercial brewing, fueled by the rise of a merchant class and urban centers, gradually surpassed monastic production in scale and market share. You might see a new, large commercial brewery being built on the outskirts of a town, its sheer size dwarfing the older, more modest monastic brewhouse. Technological advancements also played a role. While monastic brewers were innovative in their time, the coming centuries would bring about innovations like steam power, more precise temperature controls, and eventually refrigeration and pasteurization. These developments often required significant capital investment and a focus on industrial scale that was beyond the typical monastic framework. A monastery, with its focus on tradition and self-sufficiency, might not have been as quick to adopt these expensive and sometimes disruptive new methods. A quirky tidbit is that while some monasteries struggled to adapt, others embraced certain innovations, especially those that improved efficiency without compromising their traditional methods, showcasing a nuanced response to changing times. You could almost hear an older monk, perhaps a bit wistful, commenting on the strange, new flavors emerging from the secular breweries, so different from the familiar, earthy taste of their traditional brew. Historians still argue whether the decline of monastic brewing dominance was an inevitable consequence of industrialization, or if it was accelerated by the lingering effects of the Reformation and changing societal attitudes towards monastic institutions. It was likely a multifaceted decline. The Reformation's dissolution of monasteries in Protestant lands clearly removed them from the brewing landscape. In Catholic regions where they persisted, the changing economic tides and the rise of capitalist enterprise meant that commercial breweries, with their singular focus on profit and efficiency, eventually outpaced their monastic counterparts. The end of an era doesn't mean monastic brewing disappeared entirely. As we noted, some traditions persisted and still do. But the golden age, where monasteries were the undisputed titans of brewing, had definitively passed. You realize that even institutions as seemingly timeless as monasteries were not immune to the relentless march of progress and the shifting sands of economic and social change. The steady, comforting flow of monastic ale, while still present in some corners, was no longer the dominant current in the vast river of European brewing. Even with the decline of their widespread dominance, the echoes of monastic brewing resonate powerfully in the modern world. This enduring influence brings us to the legacy in modern brewing, where the spirit, techniques, and even the very styles of monastic ales continue to inspire and enrich the vibrant landscape of today's craft beer movement. It's a testament to the timeless wisdom embedded in those ancient brewing practices. Imagine a craft brewery today, perhaps one nestled in an urban industrial park or a restored agricultural building. You might walk in and see stainless steel tanks and computer-controlled systems, but listen closely, and you'll hear brewers speaking a language profoundly influenced by their medieval predecessors. They talk about malt bills emphasizing specific grain characteristics, the importance of water chemistry, and the nuances of yeast strains, concepts that, in rudimentary forms, were understood by monastic brewers centuries ago. This is a mainstream historical fact, the fundamental principles of brewing, discovered and refined over millennia, including by monastic communities, form the bedrock of modern brewing science and artistry. You can almost see a modern brewer, with a thoughtful expression, peering into a fermenter, much like a medieval monk might have, both seeking perfection in their craft. The most obvious legacy lies in the Trappist and Abbey ales of Belgium. These styles are direct descendants of monastic traditions, with Trappist beers specifically brewed within monastery walls under the supervision of monks, adhering to strict rules that dictate quality and ensure profits support the monastery and charitable works. Abbey ales, while not necessarily brewed by monks, are made in the monastic style, often under license or inspiration from former monastic recipes. These beers, known for their complexity, high alcohol content, and distinctive yeast characteristics, fruity esters, spicy phenols, are highly sought after by connoisseurs worldwide. A quirky tidbit is that the very names of some Belgian beer styles, like Double Double and Triple Triple, are believed to have originated from a monastic system of marking barrels to indicate their strength or the proportion of grain used, a simple and practical way to differentiate their brews. You might even find yourself in a bustling beer bar, ordering a quadrupel, a testament to the ever-escalating strength that brewers, ancient and modern, seem drawn to. Historians still argue whether the renewed emphasis on traditional or historical brewing in the craft beer movement is a genuine return to roots or a strategic marketing tool to appeal to consumers seeking authenticity. It's likely a healthy mix of both. Consumers are increasingly interested in stories and craftsmanship, and monastic brewing offers a rich narrative of dedication and quality. Beyond specific styles, the broader monastic influence can be seen in the craft beer ethos itself, a focus on natural ingredients, respect for the brewing process, a sense of community, and often a commitment to quality over mere volume. You realize that the very notion of a craft or artisan approach to brewing, with its emphasis on quality, flavor, and tradition, owes a profound debt to the centuries of meticulous work carried out by those medieval monks. Their quest for liquid sustenance and spiritual fulfillment inadvertently laid the groundwork for a global movement, leaving an indelible legacy in modern brewing that continues to bubble and ferment in every innovative pint. As the last whispers of our medieval journey settle around you, it's time to take a deep, calming breath and reflect on the surprisingly profound role that beer played in the lives of those ancient monks. We've explored the necessity born of dangerous water, the sheer volume of their daily intake, the meticulous art of their brewing, and the enduring legacy that echoes even in your modern glass. Now, let's take our final sips of history, letting the imagery fade into a gentle calm. You can almost feel the cool, earthenware mug in your hand one last time. The thick, nourishing ale, a comforting presence. It wasn't just a drink, it was a liquid lifeline, a source of strength that powered their prayers, their studies, and their endless labor. Remember that first morning draft, taken in the dim refectory, warding off the chill and providing the first boost of energy for a demanding day. That seemingly simple act was a testament to survival, ingenuity, and a deep understanding of their world's harsh realities. It reminds you that even the most mundane aspects of life can carry profound historical weight. Think of the bustling brewhouse, the steam, the rhythmic stirring, the communal effort. It was a place of industry, a place where empirical knowledge was honed and passed down through generations, ensuring that the critical liquid bread continued to flow. The monks, in their quiet, disciplined way, were master scientists, chemists, and engineers, albeit without the modern labels. They transformed humble grain and dangerous water into a safe, nourishing staple, providing for their community and often for the wider world beyond their walls. And those humble hops, once a curious addition, later became a silent revolution, extending the reach and reliability of their liquid gold. And then, remember the winding path of history, the devastating plague, the disruptive Reformation, and the slow, inevitable rise of secular competition. Yet, even through these trials, the core wisdom of monastic brewing endured, adapting, influencing, and ultimately laying the groundwork for the diverse and vibrant brewing landscape we know today. From the simple small beer of the peasant to the rich, dark strong ale of the abbot, beer was a thread woven through the entire fabric of medieval society, a constant, reliable presence in a world of uncertainty. The monks' daily 3 liters wasn't an indulgence, but a carefully considered, wholly practical solution to fundamental human needs. Now, as the last images of medieval cloisters and brewhouses drift away, feel yourself sinking deeper into your own comfortable surroundings. The historical whispers soften, turning into a gentle hum. The clinking of tankards fades, replaced by the quiet sounds of your own peaceful space. The heavy, bready aroma of medieval ale gives way to the clean, crisp air around you. Let the fascinating journey through time settle in your mind, a quiet story to accompany you into slumber. There's no need to rush, no need to think about anything but the soft darkness around you. The monks have finished their day's work, their thirst quenched, their bodies nourished. And so, too, can you now find your rest, knowing a little more about the liquid lifeblood that sustained an entire age. The echoes of their brewing, a story of sustenance and survival, are now a part of your dreams. Close your eyes, let your thoughts drift, and simply fall asleep. Sweet dreams.